Hi everyone, welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. I'm Brendan McHugh. I'm a bookseller here. Tonight we are very excited to welcome Caitlin Donohue for the release of Weed, Cannabis Culture in the Americas. She's joined tonight by Rhana Hashemi, founder of Know Drugs, who is a partner for tonight's event along with 48 Hills. So thank you for joining us in person and online. We are broadcasting from San Francisco, and I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land. And we hope you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action and donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization every time you hear a land acknowledgement. So a few things of business. If you haven't already, please silence your phones now. All right. And then also, while you're silencing your phones, please contemplate checking out our full events calendar on our website. We have events regularly. The restroom is behind this curtain, but it is not available until after the event, and it's available to all of you. All right. And we also have Caitlin's book available for purchase this evening up front at the cash registers, except there is no cash. We are card only tonight. And so she will also be signing after that, so just make your way to the front after the event. And so before Rhana introduces Caitlin, I'm going to introduce Rhana. So Rhana Hashemi is a drug educator, a national expert in youth overdose prevention and harm reduction, as well as a PhD student in social psychology at Stanford, where she also has an MS in community health prevention research from Stanford School of Medicine, and a BA in social welfare with honors from Berkeley. She's a founder of Know Drugs, for which Students for Sensible Drug Policy recognized her as one of 40 under 40 outstanding BIPOC leaders in drug policy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rhana and Caitlin. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out here tonight in support of this book and Caitlin. So for those of you who don't know Caitlin Donohue is a San Francisco-based San Francisco Bay Area raised, Mexico City-based, bilingual cultural journalist and drug educator. Caitlin's weekly Spanish language show, Crónica, examines psychoactive substances in times of prohibition and airs on Radio Nopal, one of Mexico's largest independent web stations. Caitlin started working as a union organizer as a teenager, and in her 20s, she began her journalism career as an intern at San Francisco Bay Guardian's alternative weekly newspaper, where she eventually began writing about culture and cannabis for her column Herbwise, kicking off a journey that years later would lead her to become a contributor for publications like High Times Magazine and a two-time judge for the Mexican Cannabis Cup. In her latest book for teenagers, Weed, Cannabis Culture in the Americas, Caitlin interviews 17 people from across the hemisphere with extensive knowledge and relationships with cannabis, from a nursing professor to an adolescent medical marijuana patient to a formerly incarcerated drug justice advocate, and a pro athlete with a legal cannabis company, and many, many more. And this book dramatically expands the kinds of information on weed and the international drug war available to teens and adults. I'm particularly so excited by this book as a resource for not only teens, but educators and any adult that wants to have a comprehensive conversation about cannabis, because so much of the dialogue, the research, the journalism, and publications on this incredibly complex plant. I've been a drug researcher and an educator for a decade now, and a person with a relationship with substances for the last almost 15 years now. And so much of the information is black and white binaries of good or bad. And what Caitlin has done by interviewing 17 different people with different relationships and investigations of this plant is shown the complexities of it. It's, I think, one of the most widely misunderstood substances out there. And I really don't think we could really understand the plant without understanding different people and how they form relationships with it. So thank you so much for this contribution. And to kick it off, I just, it is clear that you are very interested in weed. Yeah. And you wrote a whole book about it. And I just want to understand, where did your interest in this plant come from?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that intro, Rhana. I feel like I'm feeling a little bit emotional right now because this is my hometown book reading. Sunset is a neighborhood that I grew up in. In fact, one of my elementary school classmates. Dominic is here in the front row. That's really cool. So I think that you could say that my interest in cannabis does come in part from the Bay Area, just from growing up in the Bay Area. I grew up here in the 80s and early 90s, which was also the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. As many of you already know, cannabis is something that proves really useful in dealing with some of the symptoms of people who are living with HIV/AIDS and taking antiretrovirals and different medication that's associated with the health condition. And also people from that movement, the movement of people living with HIV/AIDS, were so instrumental in changing societal perceptions about this drug, laying the groundwork for California voters to legalize medicinal marijuana, things like that. So I guess for me, cannabis has never been this it's never been a frivolous drug. It's always been something that has fueled social movements, that has fueled social resistance. And I feel like I'm gonna cry. But yeah, for me, it's always been a very multidimensional thing. I started writing about it thanks to Marky B, who is here in the audience today. My long-term editor at the San Francisco Bay Guardian and also 48 Hills, which is a local Bay Area arts and culture news site, which you guys should check out. It's co-presenter of this event tonight. Marky walked into my office one day and was like, "Hey, Kaylin, you smoke weed?" And I was like, "I do." This is back when I was the culture editor at The Guardian. He was like, "That's great, because you're going to be writing the new weekly cannabis column for us, and it's going to be called Herbwise." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I think, do you remember what my next question was, Marky?
No.
Okay. As far as I remember, it was, "Are you going to pay for my medical card?" And you said...
No.
You said yes. You said yes. What is this? This is horrible ideas for participation. You said yes. And the paper said this. We love you, Bay Guardian. I wish it was, and from there, my original idea for the column was really focused more on arts and culture. So product reviews, interviewing people who make art about the role cannabis plays in their creative practice, things like that. And right in that moment was when the federal government started coming into California and shutting down state legal cannabis dispensaries, including the only dispensary at the time, medical dispensary in Marin County, which at the time had some of the highest rates of breast cancer in the country. So really quickly, I realized that writing about cannabis was always going to be this multi-dimensional thing. So the political, but also the cultural, and I just love the idea of, I think that it impacts our society in so many different ways, and exploring all those ways is forms the structure of weed, which, like you said, is built around 17 interviews with different people from around the hemisphere, largely from Latin America, but also US, Canada, Caribbean, who have experience with the drug, with a different role that the drug plays in our world. So Rana mentioned a bunch of the different ways, but it could be everything from people who have experience with it as medicine, people who have experience with it as nutrition, an aspect of their nutritional diet, the factor that sent them to jail, something that they conduct underground education around. So yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, you're right. I'm really passionate about the drug, and and I think that passion was really born here in San Francisco. So
yeah, it's every drug affects every body differently, and every body is situated within the social and cultural and political context. And so that's, I think, the international and going beyond just this hemisphere was such an amazing contribution to this. But I want to actually go back to you for a second. And there's this T.S. Eliot quote that, as an investigator myself, I think about a lot. And you are clearly an investigator, and to its fullest degree. And the quote says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring, we will be to arrive where we started and know that place for the first time." And so before we kind of go international, I actually want to go to you. And understand how your investigation into this plant helped you understand your origin story with weed.
Yeah, for sure. I had the privilege of talking with a lot of people during the course of putting this book together about how cannabis entered their lives as young people. In fact, before I started writing at all, I started doing focus groups with, like cousins and kids of friends in the age range that this book is specifically intended for, which is 14 to 18-year-olds. Just asking them, like, yeah, what role do drugs play in your life? What are they teaching you about drugs in school? What aren't they teaching you? What do you want to know? And then also throughout the process of the book, a lot of my interviewees were sharing information with me about like how cannabis entered their world as a young person. For me, on my end, I started learning about drugs when I was 11 or 12. I had a super standard education when it comes to drugs. By that point, our family had moved up to Portland. It was the first time we got priced out of the Bay Area. We moved up to Portland, and yeah, I had this super standard like prohibitionist, just say no kind of education that really it scared me. It made me really nervous, not just about drugs, but about people who use drugs, which is a concept that I think that I'll return to a bunch of times in this conversation. But I realized how privileged I was that I was able to choose, besides the whole, like, I didn't get to choose about, like, the just say no dare education that I was being exposed to. But I did, when I started consuming cannabis at 15, that was really the entry of the actual drug into my world. And I realized by talking with a lot of other people that is not a choice that everyone gets to make. Because it's not always that drugs first enter our young lives through a decision that we make about our own personal consumption. Like sometimes drugs enter our lives because drug policing has taken someone we care about away from our lives. Sometimes it enters our lives because they're a medicine that we really need to like up our quality of life, make our life more manageable. And so, yeah, I think that as white people, we have the tendency to consider ourselves like the neutral. And by researching this book in particular, I was able to learn more about my own position in society, I guess, which I think is like, it always happens when you start learning about worlds and realities outside your own world and own reality comes into sharper focus. So yeah, I love that T.S. Eliot quote. It definitely brought that home for me.
Can you remind me about your mom's reaction to when you came home with your just say no?
Yeah, totally. I've been telling this story a lot during this press cycle, but it's a good one, so I'm gonna also because some of my mom's friends, Brian is in the audience here, so you'll appreciate this. I remember like in middle school we had this like just say no, like moralistic, like your moral downfall is imminent. If you smoke, if you like use any illegal drug, and I was so scared, and I like ran home. I used to play the trumpet, so I had like my trumpet keys with me. We ran home. Awkward is the point. And then I waited for my mom to get home, and when she got home, I was like, "Mom, did you know?" I remember really clearly like saying these words. I'm like, "Mom, did you know that there's these things called drugs and they're bad, and the people who do them are bad?" And and my mom was like, "Your mom's done drugs." And I was like, what? I was like, at first I was like, call CPS, but I calmed down, and I was so lucky that my parents were willing to like counteract that kind of messaging that I was receiving in my traditional educational system, because then like a few years later when I inevitably started doing drugs, as basically all of it, I mean, we all do psychoactive substance at some point, right? I didn't bring with it that same kind of paranoia and like neurosis and like fear that I think causes a lot of people to develop kind of problematic relationships with substances.
Yeah, and like problematic relationships with friends and family. I was just having a conversation with a friend the other day, and about how that just say no, more illicit drugs are bad, you're bad if you use it education. Like when he first started to smoke weed, like he stopped going to school because he was ashamed of like the education he received, like threatened his identity, and all he was at that point then was just a drug user who was bad and a bad person. And it's really special that your mom counteracted that for you so early on, that you were able to grow up to have a healthy relationship with the plant.
Yeah, shout out Barbara.
Okay, so now let's zoom out, and I want to go international and understand, like, how did, you started off, 15 years old, San Francisco, Portland based, like, your understanding of weed and drugs was shaped by your family, your community, your dare education, and then you went abroad, and you went international in your perspective in your book. And so I want to understand now, like, when you look back, like, how did this going international in your investigation change your relationship with weed?
Totally. So I've had the privilege and honor of living outside of the United States on several occasions. Actually, the first time was when I was 15. I did an exchange program in Mexico, and that like completely opened my eyes. And so since then, I have spent a lot of time like traveling outside the country and living outside the country. But particularly with respect to like living in Mexico and my understanding of drugs, I think that it is often happens in the United States that we come to regard drugs as an issue only of personal consumption. Like our views about them are super consumerist. It's like, how is this going to affect my body? Like navigating my own relationship with drugs, etc. But as we've been saying throughout the course of this conversation already, drugs impact our lives in a lot of ways that go way beyond recreational consumption. I always tell this story about when I first moved to Mexico City back in 2014. I was bringing with me, my experiences of cannabis from like a very NorCal, like, woo, hippie kind of perspective. Like, oh yeah, pass the joint kind of thing. And I remember me and my friends were in Tepito, which is like the Barrio Brava of the center of Mexico. It's very like autonomous. There's like a thriving bootleg market there. You can buy anything. And there was a group of guys that were standing on the corner, and they were smoking this massive joint. And I was like, oh, hey, can I hit that? I just like walked up to them, and they were like, you absolutely can. Here you go. And we were like smoking. And then at the end, they were like, all right, well, we're going to go. You want to keep that? And I'm like, oh, yeah, man. And I like literally like stayed on the corner, like just like smoking this joint. And this senora, this little lady comes up to me, and she's like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? What on earth would compel you to do what you're doing right now? And was like yelling at me. And afterwards I was like, man, like she's so brainwashed. Like cannabis isn't like bad for you. Because I was thinking about it as like a personal consumption issue only, And it took me a while in Mexico to understand that cannabis is associated with a lot of violence there. Like that's really real. The drug war is like extremely real, and it's impacted the lives of every single person who lives in Mexico. And I would argue that that's the same in the United States, but it's very different in Mexico, the shape that it takes. I guess for me, it's helped a lot to be able to see cannabis from the other side of the border. And I think that my drug reporting has also helped me to understand where I stand in all this and what my role is as a white United States passport carrying person who lives in Mexico City. You know what I mean? Because the relationship between you and the US and Mexico, I don't think there could be a more complex relationship between two countries. So it's something that I'm like constantly navigating,
Right. And so like when, you're telling these stories, you're expanding the spectrum of how we can understand this plant. And for people who are educators or who are talking to youth in diverse communities, it's, when I was working in a community where it's primarily Black and brown students, like you can't talk about drug use without talking about the drug war. Like it is 80% of our relationship is environmental, like 20% at most with like nicotine is pharmacological. And so, it's so important that we develop like culturally attuned ways of acknowledging the ways that these plants and these substances impact us, because they cannot be separated from the political. And so it's so important for educators to become aware of how has this plant impacted other communities.
100%.
Okay, so another thing that I noticed that you were very intentional about, especially with like choosing those 17 interviews, was like keeping the information balanced. And so just like, what was your process for doing that? Like, how did you go about trying to, because there are going to be kids who read this book, and like that was your intention. And that's like a really hard, like, it's much easier to write a book about drugs for adults because, you're playing it a little bit safer, but like your intention was this was going to be a resource for teenagers. And so how did you go about trying to keep this balance?
Totally. Well, one thing that I tried to do was maintain, I know this is not like necessarily the main thrust of this question, but like one thing that I really wanted to do was maintain a geographic balance. Because I think for me, that was really key to like presenting like the kind of like panorama of cannabis that I was looking for with this book. So yeah, it was doing a lot of research and really like, leaning quite heavily on this extended network of journalistic resources, of different activists I've come into contact with, of different educators, of different drug users, from throughout mainly, again, Latin America, who were connecting me to their friends that had, say, a business in Medellin that develops boots made out of hemp, young people from like young people from other parts of the world, like Alejo Schroeder, who's a 14-year-old from Buenos Aires, who shares his experience of using medical cannabis to deal with the symptoms of his cerebral ataxia. So that was one thing that I think that provides a certain amount of balance. Originally, I wanted the book to be weed world. Like originally I wanted it to be the whole globe, but I signed the contract in 2020 and we all know what happened in 2020. So watch out for the second part of this for Eastern Hemisphere. So that's one thing that I tried to do. Another part of it was I don't really believe in like, I think this is another holdover from my like Bay Guardian days, but this like myth of like objective journalism, right? Mm-hmm. That we're both citing every single thing that we write about. I don't believe that that's realistic. And I think that what journalists do have the responsibility of doing is announcing their biases, right? So in this book, I make it very clear. It begins with my own experience. It's like the history of my own relationship with cannabis, from being a consumer and then also being like a professional in the world of cannabis media, things like that. And then I talk about, we do get into like some of the health effects of cannabis on young bodies, and I make it really clear, like, okay, I personally, if you're gonna, like, we don't have definitive science around cannabis, that's just a fact, like a century of prohibition has left us quite handicapped in our knowledge of this plant, which is unfortunate because this plant we've had a relationship with for 12,000 years, but right now we're not really understanding scientifically how cannabis impacts our bodies in a lot of ways. But I was quite clear in the book that what we do know points to the idea that young people perhaps don't want to be participating in heavy cannabis use, right? Because it has to do with certain suggested impacts that it might be having on our cognitive development and also on the development of different mental health conditions. So I say that in the book, and I'm like, but I said it like this: if you want my advice, I would say don't like dive super heavy into weed before you're of age. But I think that like if you want my advice is there, and what I'm really here to do is supply people with the information as it stands today. There's also a cautionary note in there that this stuff, our knowledge of cannabis, is evolving at a rapid rate. The stuff that's in this book is not going to look the same in 2 years. So I really want like the young readers and the old readers that take on this book to use it as a jumping off point for their cannabis education, or if it's not the exact start, like let it be like one place where we can go to gather our thoughts about this, but know that the journey is not ending when you put this book down. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, and it's like there's so much agency that you give the reader, and I think that's like the most important part about like how it's not just like the information, but like the attitude that you deliver it with.
Totally.
And the attitude makes people more receptive, especially young people who feel like they've been told their whole lives what they should think and do about drugs. Mm-hmm. But they're at the age where they're also being told like take risks, like learn by doing, and it's contradictory. So you are delivering the information that it is not advised to use this while your brain is still developing, because the high is induced by state changes in the brain, and when you just change your state consistently over time when you're still in development, it results in trait changes. We don't know, it's super vague, I don't know what that means, but like, you do things repeatedly, it's gonna get hardwired.
Yeah, because at the end we're talking about a psychoactive substance, and at the end of the day, and I hope that this is also another thing that people get out of this, is that we have to monitor and analyze our relationship with all psychoactive substances, and not just the illegal ones, like also with alcohol, also with coffee, also with refined sugar. Hello, like kids eat a lot of refined sugar that has psychoactive effects on them. So I just want it to be like clear that like when we're talking about drugs, it's like we have to be active in our drug consumption. We have to be actively educating ourselves.
Totally. And it's like, we throw the word like just say no around a lot because it's a cultural meme in a lot of ways, but we're not in just say no anymore. We're in just say nothing. Like, we stopped talking about drugs because we became so paralyzed by knowing that what we would see was a lack of information, it was misinformation, and now we're going through all these like cultural and political changes in our attitudes, and we're just like putting our heads in the sand and not talking to kids anymore. Like, that's the state of drug education. We'll get into that, but that's, you didn't only just provide a resource of information that was, that spanned geographies, you also gave adults a language for how to talk to teens.
Oh, cool. I'm glad.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna get now woo-woo with that.
Okay.
Okay, so if you had cannabis, what do you call your plant? Is cannabis, pot? Like, what is the name? Weed. If you had weed in front of you right now, what is a question you have for weed? What would you want to know from me?
I love this question. I want to hear, maybe this can be like our topic for the after cocktail. I don't want to hear everybody else's answer from this. But what instantly came to mind for me when you asked that was, I would love to know how cannabis wants us to form a relationship with it. Because I know a lot of cannabis people. Like you mentioned, I've been the judge of the Cannabis Cup in Mexico a couple of times. There's a lot of professional cannabis people that consume an excess of cannabis. And I'm always like wondering, I'm like, is this like an ideal consumption of the plant? Does this really like show how much we love cannabis when we're just smoking like 24 grams in like a 3-hour session, which I've seen people do, which is nuts. I mean, no judgments, but for me, it is different from my own consumption. So I'd love to hear like how cannabis enjoys being consumed and in which methods and like to which, like what frequency and things like that. There's a chapter in the book that really had me thinking about this, the idea of dialoguing with cannabis, and it's an interview with First Man, who is the founder of a place in Jamaica called the Rastafari Indigenous Village, which is this cultural center that they've set up to educate tourists about the Rastafari lifestyle, belief system, and that includes their interactions with the cannabis plant. And he talks a lot in the book about how it's not about teaching people how Rastafari use cannabis. It's about teaching people about the relationship that Rastafari form with the cannabis plant, which is a similar process to the relationships that they form with all the living things around them, and this idea of coexistence and things. So yeah, I love that woo-woo question. That's my woo-woo answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really hard to separate our behaviors from capitalism and like the system that we live under, and we've learned how to use drugs under a capitalist system and patriarchal, like most of us like learn to drink and smoke with male bodies, and it's so I think the question around consumption is really important, and how does the plant want us to be in a relationship with it? And relationships are bi-directional. Like, we can't just like use and extract. I didn't prep you on this question, but I want to go one more direction here, because you have such a deep personal, professional, like journalistic experience with weed. And when you looked at people who've had cultures or people themselves who've been in right relationships with weed, and as we all know, relationships change. Sometimes they're problematic and sometimes they're healthy. When you've seen the healthy and the right ones, what were some of the qualities of those? or like the values that were expressed?
So I think that, as you know, like the right relationship with cannabis is going to vary considerably from person to person, right? And we've talked about it in this book. Like for some people, the right relationship, like Jolene Rivera,
healthy relationship.
Sure. Like her version of a healthy relationship with the plant is cooking with like non-psychoactive hemp flower and hemp seeds and things like that. That is her relationship. Like other people use it as a building material to build houses. That's their healthy relationship. Things like that. What they all share in common is that they've done their homework, is that they have gone out of their way to educate themselves on this plant, which, to the best of their abilities, which, as we know, in prohibition, in a prohibition guided society, can often be very difficult because prohibition, one of the impacts of prohibition means that we're not receiving information about the consumption of these substances. So I think that it comes down to education. I wanna cut that answer there because we have 10 more minutes before we go to the Q&A, and I want to make sure that I get to ask you some questions about your research. And I do want to make clear, they said so. Rhana founded an educational program called Know Drugs, but that's KNOW.
Yeah,
drugs.
We have to say that.
Yeah. I love that name. So great. So Rhana, you are one of my like experts on harm reduction based youth drug education, which we know is always important. But is there anything happening in the United States in 2023 that makes harm reduction based youth drug education particularly important?
Okay, there's two things happening. One, we all know that we're in an overdose crisis, largely driven by synthetics. Synthetics being things like fentanyl, xylazine is now a new one. And there's just going to be more. Like when you have an unregulated drug supply, you're just going to be pressing people to essentially find cheaper and more potent ways of manufacturing and transporting drugs. So this is only going to get worse. And we're at a point now where teens are dying at a faster rate from drug overdoses than any other age group. There was between 2018 and 2020, 150% increase in teen overdoses. What that means is that on a weekly basis, there is a classroom size of kids who are dying from buying pills that are misrepresented. They're not buying fentanyl. They're going on social media. They know about Xanax. They know about Oxy, the perks. These are pills that the fact that they were legal and they were coming from doctors and always made teens feel somewhat safer experimenting with them. Some teens. But now, I think there is, most of these pills are contaminated with a lethal dose. The DEA and their confiscation of these pills, 60% of the pills that are just confiscated contain a lethal dose of fentanyl, which, you cannot detect by the eye or smell or anything. So we have an overdose crisis. Kids are also taking these pills at school and dying at school, unfortunately. Mm. And this has inspired is, for the first time in U.S. history, we are mandating overdose prevention education in schools. Not federally yet, but now we have 4 states that in the last 4 months, I've been doing this work for 8 years, no one cared about harm reduction drug education until really the overdose crisis. Harm reduction is now so much of a buzzword. If you don't hop on the bandwagon, you're really just going to get fallen behind. One of my clients is the state of Tennessee. Illinois just passed the first law mandating school-based drug education. Oregon, Texas. There's one more I'm blanking, but so we have this huge public health crisis happening alongside, for the first time, political will to push and drive for policy change that mandates education in school, which would also come with teacher training on how to administer Narcan and teach about that. And the gap between those two it's really a knowledge crisis. Every overdose death is preventable. A large part of what led us to this is we lied to people about drugs and they figured it out on their own. In the process of figuring it out, people died and they continue to die as well. When you do surveys, there's a recent survey that came out, 60% of teenagers don't know what fentanyl is. And they still think that heroin and cocaine are more dangerous than fentanyl, which is not true. And so it's a knowledge crisis, it's an overdose crisis, and we're catching up to the fact that schools are ground zero and we need to prepare for honest conversations about drugs in school and safer use strategies for those who use.
I have a follow-up question to that. So I know in Oregon, the legislation the new regulations that you're talking about mandates that there be education in classrooms around fentanyl. Do you think that there is there any issue with beginning youth drug education with fentanyl and overdose prevention?
That's a really good question, because I actually think it goes both ways. I know what you're talking about. It's like, are we going to start with the scariest and the baddest?
Right.
And then we're going to talk about weed? I personally, I have in my harm reduction practice, which is also my organizational practice, I meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
And for many people, many schools, they feel comfortable starting with fentanyl because, as you have shown, this is much more complex. We all pretty much agree that fentanyl is dangerous, and everyone should know about Narcan and test strips. Even the most conservative states are talking about this now, and they're putting out billboards. But not many people want to talk about cannabis because some people are going to say, but it feels good, and it does, and it makes me feel relaxed, and I prefer to alcohol. It becomes more complicated. And so on one hand, I think it's an easier entry point, but I think we have to make mandates that we don't stop there, because the same way that we're providing honest information about fentanyl and safer use strategies, kids deserve that information for all drugs. So I think it's one of those things where it's at least there is, right now, I'm grateful for the fact that there's political will. How we actually implement that, it's going to require us to become more comfortable talking about all drugs.
Totally, yeah. I'm wondering, my next question was basically about how you would characterize the state of youth drug education in the United States, which I think that you've done a pretty good job of beginning to answer there. I'm wondering maybe if we can expand that to talk a little bit more specifically about Know Drugs and how has it been for you trying to get this program instituted in schools? What's been the general response of different educational systems? Tell us about what it's like trying to get more comprehensive harm reduction based education into these schools. And I'm going off script.
No, you're good. Well, first I'll say beyond what I just said about the state of drug education going from just say no to just say nothing, after doing this work for 8 years, it's really not the kids that are the issue, it's the adults, in my opinion.
Right.
We are just not educated about drugs, and we become very uncomfortable to start a conversation with a child. We're afraid of condoning or condemning. And it's really hard to stay balanced when, many of us either receive fear-based drug education. Many of us have also, if you are a person who uses drugs, you've also experienced drug-related trauma or seen drug-related trauma in your community. And so we've got baggage. We need to process that. We need to become educated in a neutral, fact-based way, as fact-based as we can. So there's a strong need for teacher trainings, and that's one of the programs that we built out with Stanford. The question was, how has it been getting to schools? I don't know. I mean, I'm in the Bay Area. It's been pretty easy. All my clients are inbound. For the last 8 years, it's just been, I've been working in the most progressive places, like Oakland Unified School District, working for the Drug Policy Alliance, National Harm Reduction Coalition. It's people who are already with it. And, when they're not, you don't ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness. And, a lot of my work initially trying to figure out how does this work, how do you deliver reality-based drug education in classrooms, was in collaboration with students, because I could get them to say what I need to say. I don't need to ask for, is this curriculum okay? No, the kids made it up. And that was the early days of this. Now it's a lot, like I said, it's in demand. People want this education, and there's a lot of people hopping on the harm reduction train that before were drug-free America. And that kind of makes me, gives me the heebie-jeebies, but I think we have a chance to really do this right. There is, for the first time, national investment in harm reduction. And we're recognizing that we've really let kids down, and we've failed them, and we failed parents as well. And so I think it's, for the most part, we're going in a really positive direction. I think.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that we're going in a positive direction.
And I'll just say, if you have a child, if you are a parent or parents, the Safety First curriculum, which is the nation's first harm reduction curriculum that we developed, in partnership with the Drug Policy Alliance, is now it's available for free through Stanford University. You can just Google Safety First or the Reach Lab, and it's a one-stop shop for school-based curriculums, evidence-based, teacher trainings. Everything is free. And so we've made it really easy for schools to access curriculums. It's now about like, how do we make them comfortable to use it? And parents and teens are really great advocates for what should be taught in schools.
Beautiful. We have to go to the Q&A, but just before we do that, if someone here wants to know more about Know Drugs, where can they go for that information?
KNOWdrugs.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rhana.
Thank you.
I wanted to open up the floor to if anyone had any questions or comments about their own youth drug education, or if they have comments about conversations that they've had with young people about substances that have gone good, bad, mediocre. I just want to hear what you guys, there's a lot of really smart people here, so I would love to hear what y'all have to say about this issue.
Actually, I have a question about going back to kind of the process of the book, if that's okay. Maybe this will give folks some time to think about what they want to say about the conversations with young people.
For sure.
I'm curious about your decision to select your subjects for the book. It sounds like you've kind of spotlighted people who are prominent in their communities or who have some kind of name for themselves. You talked about balance already in terms of geographic balance, emotional balance, but I'm also curious about how you balance people who are sort of within the cannabis circuit, kind of known figures with more everyday people, as it were. And how did you decide whether to, in a lot of interview-based books, people do amalgamations. They interview 3 teenagers who have very similar relationships, and then they kind of form one character as a result. Did you consider that at all? How long was your process of finding your subjects, and how did you decide whether to go for kind of quite well-known people whose work you wanted to foreground,
right,
or people who you felt were kind of just regular random people?
Right. Thank you for that question. That's interesting. So I am I'm an extremely literal person. I never do fiction writing, so amalgamating people sounds really hard to me. I also am just so obsessed with the art of the interview. The book is all Q&As. It's literally back and forth. It's the edited transcripts of our interviews. And I love that way. I mean, perhaps you can tell from the way that we structured the presentation today, but I really love that way of sharing information where it's 2 people going back and forth and asking questions about each other. So I really, and also just to spotlight, in a very self-centered way, spotlight what it is that I do, which is I interview people. This is my, for the past decade and a half, I've been interviewing people about cannabis, so I wanted that to be reflected here. That's really interesting. I do think that most of the people are figureheads in their community. I think that's for sure. And people who have made the conscious decision to speak publicly about cannabis, which in some of the places where people live in this book is is a big decision to make, and is a brave decision to make, because it could have real ramifications for people. So yeah, I'm trying to think of someone who never has spoken publicly about these issues that shows up in the book. There's not really a lot of people. They're either because everyone in here has had a very No, I take it back. Oh my god, he's gonna be mad at me when I say this, but one of my best friends is in the book. His name is Richard Villegas, and he's a music journalist. But I wanted to have a chapter in here that was somebody talking about an edibles trip that went south. Because I feel when we're talking about harm reduction in cannabis, we need to talk about edibles. I feel a lot of people in this room know what I'm talking about, but that's where some of your more negative experiences with cannabis can come out. So Richard is not in any sense a big cannabis guy. He barely smokes weed. I think we're roommates, so he's been smoking more in the last year or so. But he doesn't like talk about cannabis in his journalism. So yeah, maybe that is the everyman of the book is just like a dude who like decided that he was gonna bake a cannabis cake at the age of 19 and like then drank a bunch of wine and like didn't and then thought his cab driver was trying to kidnap him. Like that's so there's not too many like every person experiences in there, but definitely people who are tailoring in this book. They're tailoring their words to like a very normal teen who may or may not have consumed cannabis, may or may not be interested in consuming cannabis. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer.
Broca Stewart?
Hello. There's nothing on your cover that says anything about teenagers.
Yeah.
Is that on purpose to like skirt by the man? Or like, because the flip side was like, you could become a banned book and sell 1 billion of them.
Totally.
You do the opposite. So did you all like, when your publisher talk about that, or how'd that come about?
No, and I think that, I mean, let's see, we're kind of sitting in the YA section right now. I don't actually think that most YA books say on them that they're YA books. They're just like, you find them in the YA section.
But they're also not about drugs either. Like YA books.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. But yeah, I think that was because the people who published this, they're not big. Did you find one, Shane? Does it say for young adults on it?
I mean, we know what it's talking about.
The publishers that published this book, Learner, they are not like a drug publisher. They are like a venerable. If I'm saying that word correctly, oh my god, am I saying that word correctly? Okay. They've been around for a while doing young adult books. I should specify that the imprint of Learner that it came out on is Zest Books, which is actually started here in San Francisco and is like a very social justice minded sub imprint. But yeah, Learner has been around for 1 million years, and like a lot of the stuff they publish is very like straightforward youth drug stuff. I mean, not youth drug stuff, youth books. So I think that they were pretty much just following the conventions of the YA book industry. But thank you for that question. Mm-hmm. Miss Nastya, yes?
I grew up during the DARE era, but I'm just curious, what kinds of questions do teens and kids that are growing up today, with weed being so normalized, have?
Okay, so I just did the most fun presentation on Monday. The SF Skate Club runs this after-school drop-in program called EduSkate over on Divisadero Street. It's really cool. You can go and visit it too because it's like a skate shop that has all their like adorable merch in the front, and then in the back you can kind of like sneak around and see like the art center and things that they have going on back there. But I got to present directly to them, and it was one of the first like IRL youth presentations that I've done during this book cycle. And I was trying to like make that more about, there was like, I did do like a little cannabis like world history section of the presentation, but we're also talking about like really basic principles of harm reduction, like, mindset and setting, don't consume by yourself, all these things. And talking to them about like, what is a drug, who is a drug user, things like that. And they had some really interesting, this one kid goes, I eat a lot of salt. I love salt. Am I addicted to salt?
Yeah. The question that I'm addicted to boba, I often get.
Right. And I was like, I don't know. And I was like, Googling, I was like, is salt a drug? Like I was Googling and I read the presentation, right? And yes, and it turns out that sodium chloride is considered a drug. It does have psychoactive impact. So you can be, I would say then, yes, you can be addicted to salt. Although again, salt is something that we all need to survive. So it's like a weird thing. You know what I mean? But like, yeah, there's, that like, there's 12 steps groups that for like codependent relationships, there's 12 steps groups for gambling. So it's not like, I don't know, like this idea of what we can be addicted to is quite large, Yeah. And then another question that they asked, one kid asked me what the effects of cannabis are, which I thought was really cute. And I also didn't know how to answer it because I'm like, everything, like.
Those questions get me. Like, how do I put you in the brain?
Right. I was like, okay, well, the thing is that sometimes we go into drug use with certain societal expectations about what these drugs are going to do to us, and often that can color the impacts that it has on us. Because we all have these friends that get too paranoid when they smoke weed to smoke weed, right? But then a lot of us subject of relax. So that's a tricky one.
I just try to keep it very basic with the endocannabinoid system.
Oh,
And
cool,
there
yeah.
are these different parts of the brain, and some people have more receptors in their amygdala or the hippocampus, and this is what the parts of the brain do, and this is what happens in what a cannabis overdose can look like. I would say the question that I get a lot is, how bad is it if I smoke one time? like there's this like fear of becoming an addict immediately that they have,
Right.
and it's like, these are always hard for me because I like the answer that I'm going to give you is going to be like, you're not going to become an addict, but I also it's such a spectrum that you can go down as well, and it's much easier to not slip down the slope if you just waited until like you had, I wouldn't even just say that it's like brain development, but also like life development, like you had things that you prioritized and valued, and exercise, like boundaries and self-control. But yeah, it's a lot of fear around like if I am going to do it, how can it's either if I'm going to do it, how can I be safe, or if I, how much is too much, or if I use it, will I become addicted?
Yeah. Another really cute thing that this gave, I mean, not cute, that's a horrible word to describe this phenomenon. But what they started talking about too was this idea that like people will see them and assume they smoke weed because they're skaters, which they're like 11.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's like a heavy thing to be dealing with, but it was really interesting because that kind of gave us the idea, the opportunity to talk about like how calling someone a drug user as an insult.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? When it's like, we're all drug users, but like when someone calls you a drug user, they are probably trying to call up these like negative associations with that term.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was really cute. But yeah, check in with me after the end of the tour and some more stuff. Continue.
Was there anyone you interviewed who surprised you, who's like expressed something, or who said things whose perspective turns to be not what you expected?
Oh, that's a super interesting question. Hold on, let me I think that someone who did surprise me in an incredibly positive way is I've been giving Al Harrington a lot of props throughout the talking about this book. Al is a 17-year NBA veteran. Perhaps some of you know him because he played on the Warriors for a while. He now has a cannabis company called Viola Cannabis, which is named after his grandma, which is a whole other adorable story. But I was so happy to come into contact with him because it was very difficult to find people in the licensed cannabis industry who wanted to engage with a youth drug education project. And people were just terrified that it was going to look like they were marketing cannabis to teens, and there was like no words. They had no way of imagining what a dialogue with young people about drugs could look like that's not don't do them or do them. Do you know what I mean? So I was so happy that his team and him were like super on it. When I finally got in touch with them, they were down. And then during the interview, it became clear to me why that was, why he was like so, why I didn't need to explain to him why we need more out of youth drug education, because not only did I find out he has like young adult kids, which explains why he's comfortable with talking about this stuff. But also, and I think just as importantly, he talks about his experience of having been criminalized for cannabis beginning at 8 years old. You know, like him and all his other like young friends being like lined up in front of the deli that they used to hang out in front of and being like shook down with the excuse that the cops were looking for weed. And this was like way before, like decades before this man would consume cannabis. So yeah, I think that was one of the people that really like opened my eyes to the ways in which like my own early experience with drugs had been quite specific, and how these things can vary from person to person for sure. So. We have one more question. Devon.
Oh yeah, I'm the last one.
You're the climax.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that like this year, I called my mom, who's from Costa Rica, and I was like, "You lied to me. You lied to me about what drugs do. You lied to me about weed." And it's a conversation that I think is like really important. And obviously, that's not exactly, she didn't exactly lie to me, but that's what she was taught. But this is why I feel like I'm just so proud of you. This is one of the most important contributions that we can do for the movement right now, is to have a book like this that teenagers can educate themselves, as you know, and know like what they can make the decision for themselves after reading a book like this as to what drugs are gonna do for them. And I guess my question for you is, what's your favorite stoner movie?
I mean, I'm gonna have to go with Smiley Face.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. It's like a woman protagonist stoner movie. Rhana, what's your favorite stoner movie?
How High.
How High? Okay, yes. That's a great note to end on, honestly. Well, I just want to thank you guys so much. And also, like, if you know of any youth organizations, it doesn't matter like how small the group is, like, I'm super down to present this book to them. Obviously, I'm going to be returning to Mexico in a little bit, but it can be by Zoom or whatever. So yeah, spread the word to the teens in your life, to the parents in your life, to the educators in your life. Rhana, thank you so much. It's just like, I just feel you were like one of the first people to like sign on to doing a book event with me, and we did not know each other like at all, and the trust that you placed in this project was really it was just really important to me. I like went through some nervous crises like in the run up to this book being dropped, and like the support of people like you like made a big difference. So
thank you so much for doing this work.
Oh, it's amazing.
That was so great. One more round of applause. Congrats. Books are for sale at the registers, and remember, when you buy a book from us, you're not only supporting independent booksellers, you're also supporting writers like Caitlin, maybe one day you, and you also get a book. And Caitlin will be signing books back here. Help yourself to some beverages, and thank you so much for coming. Good night.
Yay. Can I get one group photo of y'all, because you're just so beautiful? Maybe you guys. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Actually, wait, can I be in it?
Oh, yeah. I can do this. Let me do the whole lot of listening. All right. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Okay, that's so
Thank
good.